Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. Crazy comic book prices. I made a video about this maybe a month ago or whatever, talking about pricing being too high or whatever it was, and I got a bunch of good comments on that. And I even made videos about this a few years back when comic book prices were really going up because of all the things that were going on in the world and all that sort of stuff. I think now comic book prices have come down considerably, especially on some of the bigger keys, but perhaps not what they were before 2021, before 2020, all that sort of stuff. But I've seen a couple of videos where, people are talking about prices being outrageous and all that stuff. And I've made this comment before on this channel several times. There are always people that are complaining about something. Sometimes I feel like on my channel, I have a bit of a negative slant on certain things. But I've been watching some of these other channels. Everything is like just so negative about comic book prices, comic book this, comic book that. I mean, geez, you wonder why these people are even in the hobby to begin with. But like I said, sometimes I've made negative videos, and sometimes I go back and say, oh man, I think I've been a little too negative, but nothing like this. So let's talk about the prices aspect. Now, I wrote a little list here that I think might, this is like a spiritual sequel to the video I made about a month ago. Some of the points I make may add a little bit to the points I made in that video. Some of the points here might be new, but I want to try to keep this organized. So I have 3 points here about this that I wanted to share with all of you. And of course, you can mention things in the comments, but this is just my opinion. This is the way I see things. That's all I could offer you. That might be worth something, that may not be worth something to you. The first point I have written down here, I think it depends on where you go when it comes to pricing. Now, yeah, there are some comic book shops out there that are pricey, but I think from my experience with my own comic book shop, that's not the case. Okay, I mean, he prices his books, and sometimes he goes around and updates them too, based on current market value. Okay, now where do you get the current market value? GPA. I get it from GPA. Other people could get it from eBay sold listings, Inherited sold listings. There's a number of different places that I don't even know about, that maybe you know about, where you can get current comic book prices on certain grades and books and all that stuff. So, you got to base that off of those sold listings. So when you go to the comic book shops, sometimes there's a book that's over that price, and that might be a crazy price. Well, you just move on. Be patient. If you really want a certain book, sometimes being patient counts. I made that point in one of my other videos, right? You don't necessarily have to buy something that is a ridiculous price. And if you're going to these shops and they're just ridiculously overpriced, well, don't go to that shop anymore. But from my experience, the main shop that I go to, and some other shops in my area at least, I don't find them overly priced. They're pretty much priced around GPA. I believe that's what my guy and some of the others use to price their books. So I haven't noticed anything crazy when it comes to pricing. And I think another point about this, before I move on, I think sometimes collectors have these unrealistic goals when it comes to buying comics, that they want such. I'm not saying this is for everybody, and I'm not saying this is for every situation. When I make these videos, sometimes people only hear part of what I'm saying and then run with what they're thinking. No, you listen to the whole thing. I'm not saying that this is everybody, but I do feel, and it's just been my experience, that sometimes when it comes to pricing, that, I think it's outrageous, it's crazy, it's this, it's that, I think some buyers, collectors are going into places to buy these books, whether it's a store or convention. I'll cover convention in a few moments, with very unrealistic prices, that they want such a deal, or they're expecting such a deal on a book that any price would seem like it's crazy. That's just my opinion. That's my experience. You know, there are just some people that don't understand that. There's a book that, you know, we have all this data that says that this book is worth, let's say, $400, but I only want to spend $200. Well, maybe you might get lucky, but I would think that probably most of the time you're not going to get lucky with that sort of price in mind. That's just what I think about it. Now, like I said, you go to comic book shops. But another thing before I move on to the next point, this is point one, going to comic book conventions. Now, I know Heroes Con was recently. I wish I could have gone to Heroes Con. You know, I mean, I've been to Heroes Con once, several years ago, where I met my friend Mike in person, and I hung out with my friend Patrick, and met a few other people there, which was nice. Not friends or anything like that, but I enjoyed going there. And yeah, there were some times where books were a little higher than what I would have liked to have paid, and maybe a little higher than GPA, but not too high. Now, that was back then. I don't know what it's like now, but I've been to a few shows recently. But my point that I'm trying to make about the cons is, if you go to a place like Heroes Con, if you go to a place like San Diego, you go to a place like New York, the prices typically are going to be higher because the dealer is trying to make the most. Some of those places like New York Comic Con or San Diego Comic Con, that's like the WrestleMania of cons for them, where that's where the big money comes from. Yeah, sure, they have opportunities to make money in other places like Chicago and these other little cons, Baltimore. I like Baltimore a lot, and some Heroes in North Carolina and so forth. But that's the one that I think is the most expensive for them to set up. A lot of them travel far distances. Not all, some are local, the tri-state area. But that's where they're really trying to make up some stuff. And, you know, probably some of that stuff doesn't sell. But I think if you're going into New York Comic Con or San Diego Comic Con, I'm going to get a deal on an Albedo too. You know, that rare first appearance of Usagi Yojimbo. I don't know if that's going to happen. First off, finding it is going to be a problem because it's a rarer book. Well, let's just say any book, like, you know, that you really like, a key book. Oh, I want to get Avengers #1. I'm looking to get a really good deal on it. Where? Heroes Con? New York Comic Con? San Diego? You're looking to get a deal at those places? Really? Well, if you get a deal, great. Good for you. I hope you do. But, you know, I don't know about that. You know, I mean, there might be some other things about getting a deal if you're buying that book, like other little things you have to, if you're buying several things, you might get a little bit off on an Avengers one, but yeah, I don't know about that one. You know, so it really depends on where you're going, I think. You know, I don't get disgruntled when I go to a Comic-Con and I see prices that I think are a little high. I just move on. You know, eventually, you know, this is pretty much sums me up when it comes to my collecting habits. I usually get what I want down the line, whether it's now or later or much later. I get what I want. And sometimes, well, a lot of times it's patience. You know, sometimes you just got to wait. But keeping that in mind, I wouldn't get disgruntled going to a comic book shop or going to a con and like, oh my God, the price is so out of my price range. I ask myself, is my price range realistic? Where am I? And maybe you could wait. You know, no big deal. The second point of 3 points that I'm going to make is, how do you determine what a crazy price is? Now, I might have touched up a little bit on that a few moments ago when I was talking about GPA. Now, I know some people don't use GPA. Other people may use other things and all that sort of stuff. That's fine. That's fine. But I like to use GPA to try to determine how much I'm going to spend on a book. All right. And that will determine whether or not I think it's overpriced. I mean, I very rarely say crazy price. I'm using it for this video. And I used it for that other video that I made, other videos I made a few years ago. But I usually say overpriced. It'll determine whether something's overpriced, you know, and that's what I use. So it's good to have, and probably some of you already have this, so I guess I'm preaching to the choir about this point. Some of you have your ways of telling what's high and what's low, GPA, eBay, Heritage, a bunch of other places. But just going into something and saying it's crazy price because it's way beyond what you want to spend, well, that might indeed be what it's going for. I'm not saying that's the case all the time. It may not be. It may be a lot more than what it's usually going for. Well, then just pass. And I think sometimes dealers, when they overprice something or price something very high, they probably really don't want to sell it to begin with. They just want to see if somebody's going to buy it. And I guess the argument there, or the discussion there, is that, oh, you know, someone might buy this thinking that they're going to get a deal and all that stuff. Again, you got to do your own homework. You know, if somebody says $300, but I'll give it to you for $250. Ooh, you're taking $50 off. That sounds good when really it's maybe only worth $150. So that's, you know, you don't know. Well, you should know. Yeah, whenever I'm looking for a book, and this is just me, if I'm looking for, let's say, a Strange Tales 28, I'm not going to go to a comic book, it's a Heroes Con, and say, oh, Strange Tales 28, $3,000, that's a crazy price. Well, maybe that's what it's going for. I will know what it's going for. Now, if it's a $2,000 book and it's $3,000, I would say, wow, that's overpriced. I'm not going to get that. I'll wait a little while to see if I could find it, you know, more in range with what I want to pay. And if it's something that I don't think I'm ever going to find, or I wind up not finding, which I usually find, then that's just it. You know, you just got to move on. But you should prepare yourself. You should do your homework and your research. All right. If you don't know the difference between what's a good deal and what's not a good deal, you should find out, and you should work on it. All right. That's good advice with anything in life, not just your hobby. Right. And the last point, again, one of the things I touched up on, so I guess I really only had one big point. You don't necessarily have to pay what people are asking. You know, spend less energy, and this is good because it enhances the hobby. If you're really into this, you really like this hobby, don't spend so much energy being upset with what somebody else is offering, selling a book for. There are plenty of places you can go buy books. Like I said before, you may have to wait a little bit more. But Patrick makes this great point. As a matter of fact, he made this comment, so I'm going to steal your comment, Patrick. You know, you got to really learn, and it's a bit of a cliche, but you got to learn to love what you have rather than what you don't have. Because if you're so envious of what you don't have, you know, you kind of don't enjoy life as much, or you don't enjoy the hobby as much, or you don't enjoy this as much. So I wouldn't put all my energy in like, oh God, I don't have a 9.0 Incredible Hulk 181. Well, you may not have it now. You know, in the scheme of things, it may not be a big deal to have that now. Well, maybe you could wait a little while. Or maybe if you wait a little while, it loses its importance. Well, maybe it wasn't that important to begin with. You know what I mean? So you don't always have to pay what somebody else is asking. You know, be patient. Sometimes these things pop up. I always believe if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. Even though I do usually get what I want. So maybe you could say that I'm actively looking for something. Well, if I'm actively looking for something and I find what I want, then I guess it was meant to be. But you don't always have to feel compelled to buy something if you don't agree with the price. But I wouldn't spend so much time being so negative. Because I went through this a few years ago, where if you spend so much time worrying about what you don't have, or something that's out of reach because of a price or whatever, you know, you start throwing your hands up in the air saying, oh my God, is this hobby even worth it? But upon reflection, and it didn't take me that long to figure this out, yeah, it is worth it. It's great. I love looking at my books. I wish I could show more of my books on this channel. But, you know, after a while, it's going to be like, well, I saw that book already. I saw this, I saw that. And people don't really take interest in that. People take interest in saying, oh, I went through a dollar bin. Oh, well, look what I found. I don't go through dollar bins. I just don't. Maybe I should. But I found a lot of joy in just loving what I have, you know, and just taking it as it goes. So that is my video on comic prices, my other video on comic book prices. But I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. And one last thing. And I know this is maybe something that a lot of you don't want to hear. I know I don't want to hear it too, but sometimes you have to be told what you don't want to hear. I think sometimes there are some books that you just might be priced out of. I think that's the reality. You know, there are just some books that I think you need to take a step back and, this book the ship might have sailed on that book. And you know what? That's okay. I could still enjoy what I have, and I can still enjoy the hunt. I think sometimes that's something that a lot of us have a hard time hearing, because we want so much, or we want it so badly. You might need to take a step back and say, perhaps the ship has sailed on that because of the price, and move on. Move on. Thank you for watching, everybody, and take care.